Welcome back, movie lovers. And today we are diving deep into one of the most underrated comedies of the early 2000s, a film that somehow managed to be simultaneously ridiculous, charming, and surprisingly clever all at once. We are talking about Bedazzled, the year 2000 remake starring Brendan Fraser and the absolutely iconic Elizabeth Hurley as the devil herself. And trust me when I tell you that this movie is absolutely packed with secrets, wild production stories, and fascinating little details that most people who watched this film on a Friday night back in 2000 had absolutely no idea about. So buckle up, because we are going through of the weirdest, most surprising, and most fascinating secrets hidden inside this cult classic comedy, and by the end of this video, you are going to see Bedazzled in a completely different light. Let's start right at the beginning with the origin of the whole thing, because a lot of younger viewers do not realize that Bedazzled 2000 is actually a remake. The original Bedazzled came out way back in 1967, and it was a British comedy starring Peter Cook and Dudley Moore, two of the biggest comedic talents Britain had ever produced. In that version, the devil was played by Peter Cook, and the hapless everyman wishing for impossible things was played by Dudley Moore. The original film had a very different tone, much more dry and satirical in that distinctly British way, and it was considered a minor classic. So when Harold Ramis decided to bring the concept back to life for a new generation, he had enormous shoes to fill and a very different comedic sensibility to bring to the table. The decision to shift the story from Britain to America and the devil as a glamorous, seductive woman rather than a sardonic British gentleman was one of the boldest creative choices the production made, and it fundamentally changed the entire flavor of the story. Now, speaking of Elizabeth Hurley, here is something genuinely fascinating about how she ended up in this role. Hurley was not the first choice for the part of the devil. There were numerous actresses considered for the role, and the producers spent a considerable amount of time trying to figure out who could bring the right combination of beauty, menace, comedic timing, and sheer screen presence to make the devil feel both terrifying and irresistible at the same time. When Hurley came in and read for the part, however, something clicked almost immediately. She had this extraordinary ability to be completely and theatrical while simultaneously making you believe every single second of it, and that combination of high camp and genuine conviction is incredibly difficult to pull off. What people do not know is that Hurley herself was deeply involved in the creation of her character's wardrobe, and she worked very closely with the costume department to design the various outfits the devil wears throughout the film, each one carefully chosen to reflect a different aspect of the character's manipulative personality. Brendan Fraser, on the other hand, was coming off an extraordinary hot streak when he signed on to this film. He had done The Mummy in 1999, which was a massive blockbuster hit, and George of the Jungle before that, and Encino Man before that, so Fraser had established himself as this incredibly likable, physically gifted, genuinely funny leading man who audiences absolutely adored. What made the role of Elliot Richards particularly challenging and interesting for Fraser was the fact that he essentially had to play multiple completely different characters within the same movie, because every time the devil grants a wish, Elliot is transformed into a different version of himself, whether that is a sensitive Colombian drug lord, a towering but unintelligent basketball player, or a charming but relentlessly boring Lincoln scholar. Fraser has spoken in interviews about how much he enjoyed the challenge of essentially doing multiple character studies within a single film, and the physical transformation work he did for each different wish sequence is genuinely impressive when you pay close attention to it. Here is a detail that almost nobody caught when the film first came out. The 7 wishes that the devil grants Elliot throughout the movie are not randomly chosen. Harold Ramis and his writing team specifically designed each wish to correspond loosely with one of the seven deadly sins. And if you go back and watch the film with that framework in mind, the connections become remarkably clear. The wish where Elliot becomes a rich and powerful drug lord corresponds to greed. The wish where he becomes an enormously sensitive and emotional man corresponds to a kind of excessive emotional indulgence. The basketball player wish, where Elliot has every physical gift imaginable but lacks basic intelligence, plays with the sin of pride in a twisted, inverted way. This layer of thematic structure underneath all the broad comedy was very deliberate on Ramis's part, and it gives the film a surprising amount of intellectual backbone that most audiences simply left right past without noticing. Harold Ramis is of course legendary in the world of comedy filmmaking, and the list of classics he was involved with either as a writer, director, or actor is genuinely staggering. He wrote Animal House, he Ghostbusters, he directed Groundhog Day, Vacation, and Caddyshack, and when you know that pedigree, going into Bedazzled, certain things about the film start to make much more sense. Ramis had a very specific philosophy about comedy, which was that the funniest situations arise when completely ordinary, relatable human desires collide with extraordinary and uncontrollable circumstances. That is exactly the engine driving both Groundhog Day and Bedazzled. A regular person trapped in a situation they cannot escape, forced to learn something fundamental about themselves through increasingly absurd repetition. Ramis himself acknowledged in interviews that he saw Bedazzled as a spiritual cousin to Groundhog Day in certain thematic ways, both films ultimately being about a person who has to learn empathy and genuine connection with other human beings before they can escape their supernatural predicament. The filming locations used throughout Bedazzled are actually quite interesting and not what most people assume. A significant portion of the film was shot on location in San Francisco, and the city's unique landscape and architecture provided a very specific visual identity to the scene set in Elliot's everyday life. However, many of the wish sequences were filmed in completely different locations, sometimes on studio soundstages and sometimes in places far from California entirely. The production design team had the enormous task of making each wish sequence feel like a completely distinct visual world, with its own color palette, texture, and atmosphere, so that audiences would immediately feel the shift every time Elliot found himself in a new version of reality. The Columbia sequence in particular requires some genuinely elaborate set construction, and the team spent a considerable amount of time researching the visual aesthetics of the environment they were trying to recreate. One of the most fascinating pieces of trivia surrounding this film involves the cameos and smaller roles scattered throughout the movie. Gabriel Cassius, who plays a significant role as one of Elliot's friends, was an actor who had appeared in serious films like Fallen and Wildcats, and his ability to keep a completely straight face during some of the film's most outrageous sequences was something Fraser and Hurley both reportedly found both impressive and genuinely hilarious on set. The supporting cast throughout the wish sequences includes a number of actors who would go on to have significant careers, and spotting them in their small early roles has become one of the minor pleasures of rewatching the film today. Here is something truly wild that most people have never heard about the production. During the shooting of the basketball sequence, where Fraser's character Elliot becomes an impossibly tall but profoundly athlete, the production actually had to consult with professional basketball coaches and players to make the physical comedy land correctly. The joke in that sequence only works if the basketball itself looks legitimate, because the contrast between Elliot's genuine athletic ability and his complete inability to understand basic strategy or coordinate with his teammates is what drives the humor. Fraser, who is already a tall man, worked with the production team on visual tricks to make him appear even more imposing on the court, and he did a significant amount of his own athletic work during that sequence, which, given the physical demands of the comedy involved, was no small feat. The music throughout Bedazzled is something that deserves far more attention than it typically receives. The film's score was crafted to shift and adapt alongside the constantly changing reality of each wish sequence, and the composers had to essentially write multiple scores in completely different styles that could all coexist within a single film without feeling incoherent. The soundtrack also features a number of licensed songs chosen with considerable care, and if you pay attention to the musical choices during particular scenes, you will notice that they are almost always doing something ironic or thematically pointed rather than simply underscoring the action in a generic way. This kind of careful musical storytelling was very characteristic of Harold Ramis's approach to filmmaking, where every element of the production was expected to be doing real narrative work rather than just filling space. Now here is a piece of information that will change how you watch the film's final act. The ending of Bedazzled went through numerous significant revisions during production, and at least two completely different endings were filmed and subsequently discarded before the version that made it into theaters was finalized. One of the alternate endings was apparently considerably darker in tone, leaning into the more unsettling implications of a story about a man who has been manipulated by a supernatural being throughout the entire film. Another ending was reportedly much broader and more purely comedic, essentially abandoning the emotional resolution that the final theatrical version works toward. The decision to land somewhere between those extremes, giving the film a genuine emotional payoff while maintaining its comedic identity, was a difficult balance to strike and required extensive test screenings and creative debate before the production settled on what audiences ultimately saw. Elizabeth Hurley's performance in this film is genuinely more technically demanding than it appears on the surface, and this is something that critics at the time largely failed to appreciate. Playing a character who is simultaneously charming and threatening, seductive and contemptuous, comedic and genuinely sinister, requires an enormous amount of control, and Hurley is doing that work in virtually every scene she appears in. What makes it even more impressive is that she is doing it while wearing some of the most elaborate and impractical costumes imaginable, and she never once lets the physical demands of those outfits interfere with the precision of her comedic timing. There is a reason that audiences who have revisited this film in recent years have been much more generous in their appreciation of her work than critics were when the film first released. Something that flew under the radar completely when this film came out is the degree to which it functions as a fairly pointed satire of culture and the particular anxieties of men at the turn of the millennium. Elliot's obsession with winning the love of a woman who barely knows he exists is handled with a surprising amount of, and the film repeatedly undercuts his romantic fantasies by revealing how fundamentally and unrealistic they are. Every wish Elliot makes is ultimately about manufacturing a version of reality in which he gets what he wants without doing the internal work that genuine connection requires, and the devil is essentially an external manifestation of that kind of magical thinking. When you read the film through that lens, its moral becomes considerably more sophisticated than the broad comedy packaging might suggest. The chemistry between Fraser and Hurley was something that genuinely surprised everyone involved in the production, because the two actors had not worked together before and there was no way to know in advance how their very different performing styles would interact on camera. Fraser tends toward a kind of earnest physical comedy rooted in genuine emotional vulnerability, while Hurley's approach is more theatrical and controlled, working through precise delivery and impeccable physical presentation. The fact that these two modes of performance ended up complementing each other so effectively was something that Harold Ramis has described as one of the most pleasant surprises of the entire production process. Here is a detail that requires a second viewing to fully appreciate. The devil in this film is not merely granting wishes in a neutral way and then sitting back to watch Elliot suffer the consequences. She is actively, deliberately constructing each wish scenario to exploit a specific flaw in Elliot's thinking, and if you watch her carefully during the moments when she sends him into each new wish, you can see her working out exactly which aspect of his psychology she is targeting. This makes her a much more active and intelligent antagonist than she might seem on a first viewing, and it also makes the eventual resolution of the story considerably more satisfying, because Elliot is not just getting lucky or finding a loophole. He is genuinely changing in a way that makes her usual tactics ineffective against him. The studio was reportedly quite nervous about the film's religious content during production, and there were several points at which executives pushed back against certain elements of the script that they felt might be considered offensive or controversial by religious audiences. Harold Ramis had to fight to preserve certain aspects of the story that he considered essential to its thematic integrity, and the tension between the film's willingness to engage seriously with ideas about the soul, temptation, and moral growth on one hand, and the commercial pressure to sand off any potentially controversial edges on the other, is something that shaped the final product in ways both visible and invisible. Something that nobody talks about when they discuss this film is the quality of the background acting and crowd work throughout the various wish sequences. Each alternate reality that Elliot enters is populated by a huge number of extras who have clearly been given very specific direction about how to behave in ways that subtly reinforce the particular distortion of reality that each wish creates. In the Drug Lord sequence, the background characters move with a specific kind of nervous, deferential energy that tells you everything about the power dynamics of that world. In the basketball sequence, the crowd responds to Elliot's character in ways that are precisely calibrated to highlight his particular brand of. This level of attention to environmental storytelling in the background of each scene is the mark of a genuinely skilled directorial hand. Fraser has spoken in recent years, during the extraordinary career revival he experienced following his Oscar win for The Whale, about his memories of making Bedazzled, and his reflections on the film are genuinely touching. He has described it as one of the most purely enjoyable experiences he had during that early period of his career, a film where he felt genuinely free to be silly and experiment without the pressure that came with bigger franchise productions. There is something poignant about hearing him talk about that time, knowing what came after, and his affection for the film and for his memories of working with Hurley and Ramis comes through very clearly in those conversations. The film's box office performance when it was released in October of 2000 was considered something of a disappointment at the time, earning around $40 million against a production budget that was considerably higher, and the critical reception was largely dismissive, with most reviewers treating it as a lightweight and forgettable comedy. In the years since, however, Bedazzled has developed a devoted cult following, and it is one of those films that people who saw it as children or teenagers in the early 2000s remember with enormous fondness and continue to return to. The gap between its original reception and its subsequent reputation is one of the most striking examples of a film that simply connected with audiences in ways that critics at the time were completely unable or unwilling to recognize. One final secret that brings everything full circle back to the original 1967 film. Harold Ramis included several deliberate and affectionate nods to the Peter Cook and Dudley Moore original scattered throughout his version, and most of them are subtle enough that only dedicated fans of the original would catch them. These later homages were Ramis's way of acknowledging the debt his film owed to its predecessor while also asserting its own identity as something genuinely new and different rather than a simple retread. That combination of respect for what came before and confidence in what you are doing right now is actually a pretty good description of what makes Bedazzled 2000 work as well as it does. A film that knows exactly what it is, embraces it completely, and ends up being considerably more than the sum of its parts. And that is why, more than 20 years later, people are still watching it, still laughing at it, and still discovering weird little secrets hiding inside it.